Welcome back to another reading and correcting with me, Kindar, the Tiger Writes, and Ty, the Tiger Supervisor. These are where I read a chapter from one of my stories and correct it as I go. If you want to if you want to listen to these live, it's every Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. Eastern Time on Twitch, and if you want to support me, that is on my Patreon. Today we are doing chapter 17 of A Series of Death. Trembor put the pad on the charger, wondering where his brother had disappeared to. He'd gotten the name of a few of his friends from Heralex, and from there began calling around. After more than a dozen calls, it concluded Bo hadn't gone to any of his friends for help. He glanced at Arlen Shine's file open on his screen, what he should be working on right now. But he needed to get answers from his brother before his troubles spilled over on more than just Trembor. The Coyote's case wasn't exactly going anywhere. None of the females at the club had been sufficiently angry with him to leave his body to rot, and those Arlen had seduced could prove where they'd been when he died. So, unlike Bo's situation, Arlent couldn't really get worse. He exited his office after looking the bullpen over, He exited his office and, after looking the bullpen over, headed for a Jaguar seated at her desk and typing a report. Need help with something, Golden Mane? She asked without looking up. Can you run a search for a car? She looked up, ears canted. Forgot how to send out a description to dispatch since you abandoned us? Or did someone revoke your RI license so you're reduced to begging? Trembor chuckled. You need to frequent a different class of mail if this qualifies as begging. This isn't case related, so I'd like to avoid channels. My brother got himself in some trouble and found a hole to hide in. Wouldn't he be with your family? You lions are big on that. Our father is currently pissed at him because of that trouble. Because Dad's pissed, Bo's going to be reluctant to go to anyone else in case they hand him over. And you won't? Oh, I definitely will, Trembor replied, smirking, but after I've made sure he's been extricated from his current problem. I can do that. Trevor gave her the car's description and tag number. Any special instruction to give the enforcers for when they find it? Tell them not to do anything. Maybe keep an eye in case my brother drives off before I get there, but I'll handle the stalking myself from there. All right. Yeah, I wish I knew why I did that. Okay. His brother's car. Come back here. Okay. His brother's car was parked at a crowded mall in a neighborhood Trembor wasn't familiar with. Looking at how expensive the other cars in the lot were, he didn't think Bo was familiar with it either. He'd parked among them, hoping to hide in the herd, but he lacked the mentality to understand a herd wasn't the same thing as a crowd, so his car stood out, being an older model in not as good a shape. If this was a herd, it would be pushed to the edge for a predator to stalk. Trembor chuckled. That was what he was doing. The officer who'd found it had asked around, but hadn't gotten any information. The mall didn't have cameras on the lot, so he hadn't been able to track Bo from the car to where he might have gone to, in the mall or to a nearby transit stop. There were 4 of them within a 10-minute walk, 3 buses and one subway stop. His brother had done one thing right. He'd picked a place that didn't indicate his plan, then lost his scent in the crowd. So many people had walked by, even this close to the car, Trembor only got hints of his scent. He suspected anyone who hadn't grown up with it wouldn't be able to pick it out. 2 steps away from the car, and he couldn't hang on to it. If Trembor was tracking prey, he'd go to the mall until his quarry realized they were being stalked. Their reflex would be to stick with the largest crowd. If he was stalking a criminal, he'd look for the places in the area where they were familiar with, maybe people they knew. His brother was neither, and while Trembor didn't think Bo would act like a criminal, he might try to behave the way he thought Prey did. which would make him stand out in the crowd. Predator had to fall on much harder time than Bo was at the moment before their behavior and appearances let them blend in with prey. It was how Trembor knew the panther walking among the crowd heading for the mall from the bus stop didn't belong. Why he'd paid attention and caught her glancing in his direction too often, moving close moving close to prey, trying to blend in when all they wanted was to be as far from her as they could. He ignored her. She was too far to be a threat, and she'd have to deal with a panicked crowd if she started running in his direction. He suspected she was letting him do the stalking for her, that once he found his brother, she'd move in on them. It meant she had friends around. Only idiots would think one person was enough to bring down two lions. Of course, that was a concern for once he found Bo, and starting from this location, he easily might have to search the whole of the city before that happened. Tremble walked through the bus terminal, looking for any sign his brother had been here. He checked the train station and airport since one of the bus line from the stop close to his brother's car and went to both, and hadn't found anything. Not that he'd expected to. He was tracking a scent as dead as he hoped Bo wasn't. The antelope who'd replaced the panther at the train station gave him hope. If the criminals had his brother, there would be no need to continue following Trember. He called into dispatch and asked them to get copies of both place security camera, but that would take a few days since he wasn't willing to lie and claim this related to a body. It would make things easier to put his RI weight on this, but even in this, there was a right way to do this, and then there was Marlot's way. He rubbed his temple. Again, the wolf was in his head. Trevor looked for the warthog who was his shadow across the bus terminal to force himself into the now and out of that day of betrayal. He leaned against one of the ticket kiosks, not even trying to hide. He was looking at him, directing his anger at Trembor. His bad buzz. The precinct. Trembor, he answered, trying to keep the fear out of his voice. It's Reglan, she said. I know you didn't ask me to do more than send people looking for your brother's car, but since it's been taking a while, I looked at his finances to see where those might put him, but there hasn't been any activity on that side in 3 days. Trembor sighed. He hadn't thought about that, but it made sense. Dad's a lawyer. We've heard plenty of stories about criminals making themselves harder to find by staying away from the kiosks. Thanks for thinking of it. No problem, but you realize that means he only has whatever's left of the physical money he has on him he had on him 3 days ago. There isn't a large withdrawal at that point. Trimmer nodded and tried to remember if Bo had switched completely to electronic funds or not. Most people had when the government had started pushing for it over a decade ago, but some, like Marlowe, still hung on to it. Him, because it let him do transactions with criminals without being traced, but there were others who just hung onto the old ways. His father was one. Was Bo? It had never come up. The bus station was a bust. He hadn't expected to find his brother had come through here. Trouble didn't send Golden Manes running for the hills. They prepared for battle, or so the family story went. What was left for Bo as places to hide if he had no physical funds? He shuddered at the idea his brother might be among the homeless population. He wouldn't need money there, and while it would go against everything his brother stood for, it wouldn't take long for his appearance to degrade until he fully blended in. Trember could see his brother going hungry for a few days in an attempt to throw anyone looking for him off his trail. He'd go without a lot of amenities Trember and everyone else took for granted. But not shower? Not condition his mane so it looked perfect, except for those locks that just wouldn't stay out of his eyes. Trember couldn't see Bo putting himself through that misery, which made the homeless population the perfect place for his brother to hide, he had to admit. While the homeless were numerous, and it was easy to find the alleys where they lived, finding them wasn't easy. Not only did their lack of worth make any alliance between one another unsteady at best, they also had to worry about any stranger entering their alleys. Productive people wouldn't bother with that, but the closer someone was to becoming homeless, the more appealing a free meal became, no matter how terrible the taste. At that stage, having meat in your stomach could be the difference between getting to work or sliding further toward homelessness. There were organizations trying to help to set them back on the path of productivity, and some even had a few stories of success, a male or female here or there, shaking off the stench of homelessness to return to society and play their role in making the overall productivity increase. Mostly, those organizations begged productive people for scraps, then handed to the homeless community so they didn't have to eat one another. Tremper couldn't figure out how he felt about it as he walked through a deserted alley. The stench was fresh. His approach had scattered them. On one hand, he believed everyone had their right to survival, and that, in the end, so long as they did so legally, they should get the assistance they needed. But on the other, they had there had to be a point where all this was doing was putting a derating of the people trying to help at risk. He looked back to see if any of his stalkers were back. They'd vanished while Trevor walked through the second such alley. At least now he knew they weren't as serious as he was about finding Bo, or maybe they were simply more realistic about the odds of finding him. They weren't good, he knew that. The odds of finding one lion among this mass of people doing everything they could not to be found were. He wouldn't think of them as impossible. That meant giving up on Bo, and he wasn't doing that. He wasn't giving up on family, ever. He paused by a form on the ground. The stench of the alley permeated it, so he couldn't tell much. That they hadn't fled at his approach told him they were dead. He crouched and checked for a pulse, then wiped the grime off his hand. Still warm, so the death was recent. No sign of violence on or around the body. As unsettling as the thought was, death by hunger was the most likely cause. What a horrible way to go. Better to be someone's meal than suffer like this, slowly wasting away. Did they have their ID still? Was it worth looking for it? He could inform their family. They might already consider him dead. Did they need to know this was what their relative had amounted to? He straightened, looked around. His arrival would have kept the others from noticing the death. Once he left, they'd returned, feast on the little meat this body provided. They would live an extra day because of it. Maybe this would mean one of them became a success story and rejoined society. Trevor doubted the truth of those stories now, seeing this place. Was there any way out of this? Really? He had to find Bo, which meant finding another alley because his brother wasn't in this one. As soon as he stepped onto the street, he heard the fight break out behind him. Far enough, he knew the body had caused it. Even in their desperate state, instinct of possession still existed. Predators didn't share easily. The crowd parted around him. With his multiple trek in alleys, their stench stuck to him, marked him as an outlier. Maybe he was ripe for eating. He felt the eyes on him, kept to the better lit areas of the street. With the sun setting, the odds of finding Bo in the alleys were dropping even more, and his safety became more questionable. Alleys at night were the realm of the homeless and those who preyed on them. He called Bo and got the blocked message again. Had his brother gotten rid of his pad? Sold it for currency? He hoped not. He sent him another message. Bo, night's coming. You need a real place to sleep and a shower. Just call me and tell me where to pick you up. No lecture, just safety. He made it to the lot where he'd left his car with little more than looks. He smelled like someone who could be taken down, but once his would-be killer was close enough, they saw the quality of his clothing, the sharpness of his gaze, and his teeth. They turned away. No one who stalked people smelling like he did right now wanted a real fight. Packs were who he had to worry about, where numbers made up for lack of strength and skill. A pack like the one entering the lot from the opposite side, a warthog at the lead. There had been a warthog following him multiple times throughout the day, but he'd stayed downwind, so Tremor didn't know if this was the same person or one of a group, a family, possibly a relative of the one he'd killed. Families didn't do revenge, it got too expensive, but criminals were a different thing. The way they kept each other they kept eating each other out of revenge, did most of the work of keeping them from overwhelming the enforcement system. Trembor could take the lone hog if he decided to attempt to get his revenge. His budget would take a hit, but he had freezers he could store the excess meat in. He'd rebuild his fund by not having to hunt for longer. It was the half-dozen other people with the hog that dropped his chances of being the one to walk out of this confrontation down to a statistical zero. 2 bears, a tigress, a wolf, and 2 leopard, each with the grin of someone who knew they had an easy meal coming. His one hope was to reach his car first, but it was closer to them than him. Running would trigger a chase, whether he headed for the car or away, and he wasn't prey. He didn't run. Halfway to his car, only the warthog kept walking, and Trembor judged he'd slowed so they would reach it at the same time. This no longer felt like it was motivated by revenge. Trembor unbuttoned his jacket, preferring the mobility over the protection from the cooling air. They stopped on each side of the car. A lunge from either of them would cover the distance. He readied himself just in case. He wouldn't attack, that would trigger the others to join, but he would defend himself. The warthog sniffed the air and made a contemptuous face. There's someone who wants to see you. He motioned the way he and his pack had come, and just out of the lot's light, Trembor barely made out a car. Trap resounded in Trembor's head, and running seemed like a reasonable option. Not prey, he reminded himself. He'd go down fighting, not running. And if they wanted to eat him, they didn't need the pretense of the meeting. They had the numbers. Trembor stepped toward the car, and the hog fell in step behind him as the pack parted, everyone remaining out of reach. They weren't as confident in his intention to see this through, he realized, as they formed a line to prevent him from bolting on the side or back. The stench surrounding him acted as a cloak. The car was expensive, the kind his father used to own when he worked. His way of advertising how productive he was, how successful, despite hating the things. But lawyers were one of the rare class of people that attracted predators even when they were somewhat successful, because even they failed the occasional client. A show of success also attracted clients. The back door opened a few steps away and Trembor stopped. The inside remained dark, the little street light making it in only showing shapes. 3 of them, maybe 4. One of them cried out, and a lion was shoved out of it to sprawl on the ground. I will advise you to remember this discussion, Mr. Goldenmane, a female said from inside the car, unless you wish for things to become quite uncomfortable for you. The door closed as Trembor reached his brother and was gone. The door closed and the car was gone as he helped him to stand. Bo, are you okay? His brother pushed him away, covering his muzzle. I'm fine, he snapped. You stink. Who was that? What happened to you? I've been searching for you all day, leaving you texts. His brother looked to be in better state than Trembor had feared. His clothing was disheveled, his mane a mess, but he didn't look too dirty. Where did you vanish to? I'm fine. No thanks to you. Don't lay this at my feet, Bo. I asked for your help and you told me to fuck off. Trembor bit back his reply. Bo was right. He hadn't exactly helped. Who was that? No one, his brother replied, his tone flat. Trembor cursed the stench clinging to him. It made it as impossible to pick up Bo's intent as it hid his. You can stop worrying about me. It's dealt with. Trembor narrowed his eyes, keeping his ears from folding back by willpower. What does that mean? It means that this isn't any of your business, Bo replied, just like you wanted it. That isn't. Fuck off, Trem. His brother's eyes burned with anger. You had your chance to help. I've handled it like an adult. Trembor rolled his eyes, but kept silent. Sure, running off and hiding was such an adult thing for a predator to do. He forced his breathing to slow. All right, I'll drive you home. To my car, Bo replied. I'm able to drive myself, and I don't want to be around your stench any longer than I have to. Where the fuck have you been? Trembor couldn't keep the growl out of his voice. Looking for you. His brother eyes widened. And you thought I'd hide someplace that smelled like that? I figured you were desperate. Bo snorted. I'm never going to be that desperate. This concludes chapter 17 of A Series of Death. If you are enjoying this, please leave a like. If you want to know when the next chapter is going to be up, subscribe and hit the bell. If you want to read the story as well as the other book in the series, they are available at all major e-retailer. If you are looking to support me, a different way to support me, that's on my Patreon, where you can also get access to just about everything I've written. And if you are looking to listen to these live, it's every Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. Eastern Time on Twitch. The links are in the notes. And with that, I shall wish you a good day.